Beneath the scorched sun of southern Iraq, where the wind sculpts the sand into slow-moving waves and time folds into dust, fragments of ancient clay lie buried beneath the surface, silent, but not forgotten. These tablets, pressed by human hands over 5,000 years ago, were meant to preserve more than stories or laws. They were meant to preserve something that must not be lost. But what they record isn't the beginning of human civilization. It's something older, something that does not fit within the story we've told ourselves. Something that suggests we were not the first. What if humans weren't the first intelligent species the Sumerians wrote about? What if the earliest records of the first civilization describe beings that don't match anything alive today? Beings with scales, wings, copper-toned skin, luminous eyes, and names that echo through millennia? What if the first story ever written wasn't about us, but about those who came before us? If that idea unsettles you, good. That means you're listening. Before we go deeper, if you find this kind of historical mystery compelling histories that live in the space between evidence and erasure, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss stories like this. And while you're here, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to imagine this question traveling across time zones, whispered into the dark. And if this video intrigues you enough to make your spine tingle, share it with someone who needs to hear it, especially someone who still believes humans were the first. Because that belief is about to get tested. When 19th century archaeologists first began digging into the strange mounds of southern Mesopotamia, they weren't expecting much. The land looked barren, the ruins unremarkable. Most assumed they would find crude etchings, early forms of counting, maybe basic symbols scratched into stone by primitive hands. What they discovered instead was a writing system already fully formed. Cuneiform, wedge-shaped impressions, arranged with grammatical complexity, capable of expressing abstract philosophy, mathematical calculation, and celestial observation. These tablets didn't just track trade or property, they recorded rituals, astronomical events, legal codes, and more mysteriously descriptions of beings who did not appear human. By around 3,500 BC, the Sumerians had already established a complex society. Cities like Uruk and Eridu rose from the earth in geometric patterns. Their irrigation systems stretched across vast plains. Their temples were aligned to solstices. Their base 6-0 mathematics still governs our hours and minutes today. There was no long lead-up, no centuries of primitive evolution. It was as though civilization didn't emerge, it arrived. And what makes it even stranger is that the earliest tablets don't begin with humans. They begin with others. Imagine holding one of those tablets, its surface still etched with the pressure of ancient fingers. The writing doesn't speak of kings or wars. It speaks of beings with wings, beings with scales, beings whose skin shone like polished copper, beings who emerged from the Abzu, the deep, subterranean sea beneath the earth, and who walked among early humans, not as myths, but as teachers. Some were called Anunnaki, others Apkallu, others simply those who came from the sky. These weren't poetic metaphors. The Sumerians recorded their presence with the same clinical precision they used to measure barley or track star positions, as if they were documenting biology, not belief. One tablet lists 7 sages, part fish and part man, who rose from the sea to teach humanity agriculture, astronomy, architecture, writing, and law. Another records pre-flood rulers whose reigns lasted tens of thousands of years, names that appear in no other tradition, measured in spans of time that modern historians simply dismiss as exaggerations. A third speaks of divine laborers who grew tired, rebelled, and were replaced, not punished, but engineered out of existence. Their replacement? Us. Humans, created to perform the tasks the others refused. When archaeologists unearthed the site of Eridu, the city the Sumerians called the first, they found something even more unsettling. Beneath its visible ruins lay 17 layers of temples, each built directly atop the last. The oldest levels were unlike anything else in Sumerian architecture. The techniques were different. The tools used to shape the stones left unfamiliar marks. The deepest foundations sat on virgin soil, untouched earth. There was nothing beneath it. It was the beginning, but it was a beginning that did not look Sumerian. At Kish, another ancient city, flint tools were found in layers carbon-dated thousands of years before the rise of Sumer. These were not scattered signs of nomads or hunters. They were crafted, intentional, purposeful, and they shouldn't have been there. Uruk revealed similar anomalies. Beneath its famed White Temple, massive stone foundations had been moved over impossible distances using unknown methods. The precision of their placement defied the limits of Bronze Age technology. Yet no explanation was given. Only one question remained: who did this first? The Sumerians themselves had an answer. They didn't claim credit for invention. They claimed inheritance. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki, the god of wisdom, proposes mixing clay with the blood of a slain god to create a new worker. Not a creature born from divine breath or magical spark. A hybrid. A solution to a problem. The language is methodical, procedural. This is not myth. This is engineering. Scholars try to interpret these stories as symbolic allegories for political hierarchy or religious order. But the Sumerian texts resist simplification. They specify measurements. They list materials. They reference lineages, not legends. And throughout the centuries of Sumerian literature, the claim is repeated, unwavering. Humans came later. We were not the first. Visual evidence supports the texts. In the Louvre, a limestone stele from the 3rd millennium BC shows bird-headed beings standing beside humans, towering over them, holding tools whose functions remain unknown. In the British Museum, cylinder seals show fish-human hybrids, instructing kneeling figures. In the now looted Iraq Museum in Baghdad, reliefs depicted humanoids with reptilian features, blessing Sumerian kings. These images are not one-offs. They appear across 2,000 years of art, across multiple city-states, rendered with anatomical consistency and biological realism. These were not imagined gods. They were remembered beings. Their depictions match no animal or human known today. Yet they recur with exacting precision: same limbs, same posture, same tools. Art historians have tried to label them as composite creatures. But composite of what? Why the same form? Over and over, across centuries and dynasties? If these beings were fantasy, why depict them doing real things, measuring, building, teaching? One Neo-Assyrian text describes the reconstruction of a temple using the original layout from before the flood. According to the measurements left by those who came before, it says, not inspired by dream, not dictated by vision, measured. That phrase, before the flood, is not metaphor. It is a boundary, a line, a memory of something we were never meant to forget but now barely remember. When Sir Leonard Woolley excavated Ur in the 1920 seconds, he found an 8-foot layer of clay between two civilizations. Below the flood layer, strange artifacts, older foundations, pieces of something harder to name. Above it, the recognizable Sumerians. It was as if the water didn't just bury cities, it buried history. What the Sumerians left behind are not just stories. They are fragments of a map, a record of knowledge received, not discovered. Civilization, they said, was not born but rebuilt, by human hands, guided by someone else's memory. And now, we are the ones standing over the ruins, holding the clay, trying to decide if we believe them. Imagine placing your fingers over a fragment of clay that has not felt human touch in over 5,000 years. The marks are strange, wedge-shaped and orderly, but what they describe is even stranger. These ancient tablets, authored by scribes of the first known civilization, speak not of men building cities or kings claiming thrones, but of creatures not found in the fossil record. These were not animals, not spirits, not symbolic metaphors. The Sumerians recorded them with the same language and grammatical clarity they used to log shipments of barley and dates. They wrote about beings who were part fish, part man, whose skin shone like polished copper, who emerged from the waters of the Abzu, the deep abyss beneath the earth. Others descended from the sky, radiant and tall, with heads like birds and voices like thunder. These beings had names, ranks, functions, and lineages. They ruled, taught, healed, built. They were not legends. They were written as facts. Among them were the Anunnaki, often translated simply as those who came from the heavens. These beings were portrayed as luminous, tall, and physically distinct from humans. Their features were always described with a curious consistency across time. Elongated skulls, large eyes, glowing or reflective skin, and a presence that seemed both biological and celestial. They ate, drank, and even bled, but they were not human. The clay tablets describe how they descended to earth before the rise of man, how they were involved in creating humanity itself, and how they later withdrew into the shadows of myth once their age had ended. One group stands out among the rest: the Apkallu, or Seven Sages. Part human, part fish, these beings are described as rising from the sea during the dawn of civilization to bestow knowledge upon the earliest kings. Each sage is linked to a specific domain: agriculture, writing, mathematics, architecture, healing, law, and astronomy. The Sumerians revered them not as gods, but as teachers, masters of their crafts, who gave humans the foundation of everything that followed. These Apkallu appear again and again in Sumerian hymns, Babylonian incantations, and Assyrian palace reliefs. Their iconography remains unchanged for over 2,000 years. Half fish, half man, muscular torsos rising from scaled tails, holding buckets and pine cones, tools believed to have held sacred water or ritual objects. Even the artistic details, such as the texture of their scales and the fold of their garments, suggest not symbolic abstraction, but anatomical memory. But the Apkallu were not alone. Other beings populated the Sumerian cosmology, and they were described with the same clarity. In temple hymns, figures with bird heads and wings are shown, holding measuring rods and coiled ropes, symbols of divine architecture. These creatures, too, are depicted in stone reliefs and cylinder seals, often performing specific tasks like surveying land or blessing temples. Their wings are not mere stylized ornaments. Artists from the Sumerian to the Assyrian period carved feathers with meticulous detail, showing primaries, secondaries, and even the bone structure beneath, as if based on something actually observed. Why go to such lengths unless the form itself carried precision and truth? In the Iraq Museum, before it was looted in 2003, one could find statues and reliefs of humanoid beings with reptilian skin. Some had elongated jaws, others long tapering heads and segmented, muscular bodies. These were not wild creations of artistic imagination. They were embedded into ritual contexts, carved with reverence, positioned in temples beside kings. These reptilian entities were not enemies or monsters. They were described as guides, mentors, protectors. In one cuneiform tablet, a priest is instructed to offer food and cloth to those who dwell in the Abzu, who wear the skin that shines and the eyes that reflect light. These instructions appear in administrative documents, not myths, as if accounting for supplies delivered to living recipients. One of the most remarkable artifacts is a limestone stele from the 3rd millennium BC, now housed in the Louvre. It shows a towering figure with a bird head, standing twice the height of the humans beside it. Holding an object shaped like a tuning fork or antenna, the human figures kneel before it, presenting offerings. Scholars call it a religious scene, but the precision of proportion, the anatomical accuracy of the beak and musculature, and the posture of the figures suggests something more grounded. These were not hallucinations or spiritual metaphors. The Sumerians depicted them with the same care a modern biologist might draw a new species. Some scholars have argued that these beings were symbols, manifestations of cosmic principles, or personifications of human ideals. But mythology drifts. It evolves. It blurs. It reinterprets. The Sumerians did none of that. Their portrayals of the Apkallu, the Anunnaki, and the other divine beings remained consistent for over 2,000 years, spanning dynasties, empires, languages, from the early dynastic period through the Akkadian Empire to Babylon and Assyria. The same forms appear: fishmen, bird-headed teachers, radiant humanoids. Their proportions never change, their accessories remain constant, their roles do not shift. It's as if they were not imagined, but remembered. This consistency defies typical artistic evolution. In Egypt, gods morph and merge. In Greece, attributes shift. But in Mesopotamia, these beings remained stubbornly static. The Apkallu are always 7. The bird-headed beings always hold the same tools. The reptilian figures always appear in temple contexts. This is not the behavior of a culture inventing characters. This is a culture preserving identity. These beings were remembered as part of history. Not religion, they were recorded in administrative logs. Not just epic poetry. They were revered. Yes, but not in the way distant gods are worshipped. They were documented like ancestors. Even the language reflects this. In Sumerian, the word Dingir is often translated as God, but its literal meaning is those who came from the shining. It denotes origin, not divinity. The beings described with the Dingir determinative are not floating spirits or omniscient creators. They are entities who arrived from the sky, from the sea, from elsewhere. Some walked, others flew, some taught, some ruled, and the Sumerians treated their presence not as allegory, but as inheritance. If these were simply fictional deities, why describe their diets, their need for clothing, their measurements? Why distinguish their footprints from human ones in temple rituals? Why show them building with humans, not just watching from above? The Sumerians seemed determined to tell us something not about gods, but about predecessors. To modern minds, these stories sound impossible. They challenge everything we assume about history, evolution, and ourselves. But to the Sumerians, they were simply the beginning. Their story did not start with man. It started with others who built, who ruled, who remembered. And when they vanished, the Sumerians picked up the stylus and wrote it all down, not to mythologize, but to preserve, so that we would not forget what once walked beside us. There is a line that runs through Sumerian history, not written in ink, but in mud and memory, a divide so absolute that even the ancients treated it as a point of no return. That line is the flood, not a flood, not one among many seasonal disasters, but the flood, the deluge that ended a world and marked the boundary between what was and what came after. On clay, prisms and tablets scattered from Nippur to Uruk, scribes inscribed king lists that begin in one world and end in another. These are not just royal records. They are testimonies to rupture. Before the flood, the Sumerians said, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, their reigns shrank to mortal scale. But more than time changed. Species disappeared. Teachers vanished. Cities were abandoned and rebuilt. Memory itself became a kind of mourning. One of the most enigmatic documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia is the Sumerian king list, a text that catalogues rulers from the beginning of kingship until the known dynasties of later Sumer. But the list is not continuous. It breaks at a single, haunting phrase, "Then the flood swept over." Before this line are 8 kings who ruled for a combined 200 years. After it, reigns drop to mere decades. Scholars have long dismissed these early figures as symbolic figments of numerological imagination. Yet the Sumerians did not mark them differently. The grammar remains the same. The structure is identical. The tone is consistent. The only disruption is the flood. The first ruler, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have reigned for 800 years. His successor, Alalga, ruled for 36. 000. Then comes Onmenluana of Bad Tibira, with a reign of 200 years. These numbers are so vast they border on the absurd until you realize they follow a pattern. The reign lengths are divisible by 3. 600, a number sacred in Sumerian numerology, representing the Sa, a divine time unit. These were not random exaggerations. They were intentional, encoded markers of a different order of existence, one where time flowed differently, or where beings not bound by our biology held power. Several of these kings are marked with the determinative for divine before their names, suggesting they were not human kings who became gods, but gods who ruled in human form. More curious still is what accompanies these names in alternate versions of the list. Some rulers are described as having received knowledge directly from those who came from the heavens. One king, Enmen-dur-Ana, is said to have ascended to the divine assembly and returned with the secrets of the heavens and earth. He brought back knowledge of divination, astronomy, and writing. He is described not as mythological, but historical. And one tablet adds a chilling detail. His form was like the gods, not like men. His body, it implies, bore marks of otherness. Then the flood comes, not just as a rainstorm, not as metaphor, but as obliteration. The tablets say it covered the earth like a garment, swallowed cities whole, and silenced the songs of the old ones. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest surviving accounts, tells of how the gods decided to destroy the world not because of evil or punishment, but because the balance had been lost. Only one man, Ziusudra, was warned. He built a boat and survived. His city, Shuruppak, was buried. Everything else perished. Modern archaeology has found support for this rupture. In the 1922, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated at Ur and found an 8-foot thick layer of water-laid clay between 2 cultural strata. Beneath the flood layer were signs of a simpler, older people. Above it, the rise of Sumerian civilization. Similar layers have been found at Shuruppak and Kish. Each site tells the same story: an earlier culture, buried beneath flood deposits. Then a sudden, organized rebuilding. It is not one flood, but many. Not one event, but a pattern of annihilation. The Sumerians themselves spoke of this as a biological catastrophe. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, tells the hero that the deluge ended not only human life, but the world of other beings. He sends out a dove, a swallow, and a raven to find dry land. The raven returns, feasting on the flesh of the dead. The image is gruesome. The implication is worse. Something more than humanity was lost. Something that once shared the earth with humans, perhaps even ruled before them, was gone. Art from before the flood shows the familiar non-human figures, the Apkallu, the bird-headed beings, the radiant sages. After the flood, they become more abstract, more distant. They are still invoked, but no longer seen. Their depictions shift from participants to symbols. In the administrative texts of post-flood periods, there is a quiet acknowledgement. The ancient ones are no longer present, but their knowledge remains. End quote. And that knowledge was cherished. Post-flood kings speak of restoring temples, according to the measurements of the ancients. Foundation deposits mention rebuilding on the plan drawn before the waters. These are not poetic phrases. They are literal references to architecture and proportion. It is as if the survivors were not creating, but replicating, as if the blueprint of civilization had been salvaged from the ruins and copied by hands no longer able to fully understand its origin. The theological shift is equally stark. Before the flood, beings came from the sea and sky. They taught directly. Afterward, gods dwell in temples. Distant, abstract, the Sumerians pray upward, not outward. The world becomes lonelier. A veil descends between man and those who came before. And yet, the memories persist. The flood did not erase everything. It left behind whispers, names carved into stone, proportions etched into walls, stars plotted in patterns too complex to have been invented by newly risen survivors. There is pain in the Sumerian texts, a sorrow not just for what was lost, but for the certainty that it can never be regained. The stories speak of a golden age, not one of human innocence, but of contact, an age when the heavens and earth were connected, when the cities of the plain were places of mingling, not separation. The flood did more than drown land. It severed something fundamental. It broke a chain of memory, a lineage of wisdom. It turned knowledge into myth. What remains is fragmentary. A name here, a symbol there, a building raised on foundations older than its walls. And always, the refrain, before the flood. In every Sumerian tradition, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, the flood stands like a door slammed shut. The question, then, is not whether the flood happened, but what it ended. The tablets suggest it was not merely an end of cities, but an end of species, an extinction event of entities that do not appear in our evolutionary timeline, but do in the oldest records of human writing. We are told the Sumerians invented civilization, but they tell us something else. They say they inherited it from those who ruled before, from those whose reigns spanned thousands of years, from those who disappeared when the waters came. If we take them at their word, then history did not begin with us. It restarted with us, and what came before lies drowned beneath layers of clay, waiting to be remembered. The wind that blows across the ruins of Sumer carries more than dust. It whispers through the broken walls of Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, telling a story deeper than the visible bricks allow. For while temples and ziggurats rise above the earth, the oldest truths lie hidden beneath them, in layers that predate the known, in foundations laid by hands whose identities are lost to time. Archaeologists once came to Mesopotamia searching for the first signs of civilization, but what they found challenged even the most cautious assumptions. Instead of simple beginnings, they found complexity buried under more complexity, temples built upon temples, cities upon cities. The deeper they dug, the older the architecture became, but also, strangely, more precise. Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves called the first, is the most troubling. Located in southern Iraq, it was once the seat of Enki, the god of wisdom and the watery deep. When excavators from the Iraqi Department of Antiquities and the British Museum began their digs in the mid-20th century, they uncovered not one temple, but 17. These were not lateral expansions, but vertical iterations, each new temple built directly atop the ruins of the last. As they descended, the temples grew simpler in form, but stranger in purpose. The deepest layers, known as Temple I and Temple II, were dated to around 5,400 BC, almost 2,000 years before traditional Sumerian culture emerged. These early temples sat on virgin soil. No earlier human settlement appeared beneath them. Yet the architecture was not random. The buildings were aligned with cardinal directions, laid out with mathematical precision, and constructed using standardized bricks, suggesting an inherited system, not a learning curve. Even more perplexing were the materials and methods. Some foundation stones bore marks inconsistent with copper or bronze tools, implying either harder tools or unknown techniques. A few copper implements discovered in these lower levels showed alloy ratios that shouldn't exist at the time. Ratios requiring temperature control and smelting knowledge, supposedly invented much later. One archaeologist, baffled, wrote in his field notes, "It is as though someone else built the first temple and left instructions behind." But who? At Uruk, the pattern repeats. The White Temple, crowning the great ziggurat of Anu, dates to about 3,200 BC. But beneath it, buried in strata few dared explore, archaeologists found foundations of large limestone blocks transported from quarries more than 60 miles away. These blocks were cut with such precision that they fit without mortar. The surfaces were polished smooth. Yet no known pre-Sumerian group had the tools or organizational capability to quarry, transport, and place such stones. The techniques used in these early structures don't appear elsewhere in Sumerian architecture. They are anomalies, sophisticated, yet isolated. It's as if the builders had skills no one else did, and that those skills vanished once their structures were complete. At Kish, excavations revealed a different mystery. Beneath the flood layers that marked the end of the pre-Diluvian world, archaeologists found flint blades and obsidian tools carbon dated to around 7,000 BC. That alone would be remarkable. But one find stood apart: a carved limestone block inscribed with strange symbols. These markings bore resemblance to proto-cuneiform, but predated the invention of writing by at least 1,000 years. The symbols were indecipherable. They were stored, catalogued, and largely ignored. No one knew what to make of them, but the block had been part of a foundation buried intentionally, as though its presence had meaning for those who placed it there. Foundation deposits are common in Mesopotamian construction. Builders often buried inscribed cylinders or figurines at temple corners, marking the project and dedicating it to the gods. Most of these inscriptions are standard, but some include a peculiar phrase, "rebuilt according to the plan from before the flood," not just poetic metaphor, but specific architectural claims. These statements are not rare. They appear in the rebuilding records of several kings across centuries. The phrase is consistent. The implication is profound. The Sumerians believed they were not inventing, but restoring. One particularly striking example comes from the reign of Nabonidus in the 6th century BC. He claimed to have restored the Temple of Marduk using the original measurements drawn before the deluge, which Ea inscribed on the clay of the Abzu. Ea, known earlier as Enki, was the god of deep knowledge. The claim here is not merely spiritual, but logistical. A divine blueprint, preserved through catastrophe, was used to rebuild a structure destroyed thousands of years earlier. The implication is that the knowledge survived, even if the beings who wielded it did not. But if these ancient architects left behind measurements and blueprints, where did they come from? The temples they built were not random. They aligned with solstice points, cardinal directions, and astronomical events. Their proportions followed harmonic ratios. Even the brick sizes were standardized across cities and dynasties. This kind of consistency suggests either an incredible cultural continuity or a single originating source. And that source, according to the tablets, was not human. Cuneiform hymns and administrative tablets mention that certain knowledge, geometry, surveying, engineering was received from those who came before. In one case, a tablet describes a temple in Eridu as rebuilt upon the base laid by the lords of old. In the measurements they taught before the waters came. The Sumerians did not claim authorship. They claimed stewardship. They did not pretend to have created civilization. They believed they were preserving it. Even the tools depicted in ancient art hint at this inheritance. Bird-headed beings and fishmen are often shown holding what appear to be measuring rods and cords. These are not decorative. They are the tools of architects and surveyors. On several cylinder seals, such beings are shown overseeing the construction of temples, with human workers laboring beneath them. The hierarchy is clear. Instruction flows from non-human to human. The same imagery appears on the famous Walk of Vase, dated to around 3200 BC. At its base, we see water and plants. In the middle, animals and humans. At the top, a goddess flanked by attendants, one of whom has proportions that do not match human anatomy, elongated limbs, an unusually narrow skull, and a robe that seems molded to a body not quite like ours. Museum placards call such figures attendant deities. The Sumerians called them something else, Dingir, those who came from the shining, not spirits, not gods in the Western sense, but beings of origin. So what are we left with? Beneath the cities we study, beneath the temples we label Sumerian, lie older structures built with unfamiliar techniques. Foundation blocks bear inscriptions that speak of lost plans. The architecture itself points to celestial knowledge that should not have existed at the time, and everywhere. In the art and text, there is the same message. We were taught, if this is true, then the origins of civilization are not the beginning of something, but the continuation of something older. The first cities may have been built not by humans, but for them. The first temples may have been copies of lost originals, and the first measurements angles, bricks. Alignments may have been echoes of plans drawn by hands no longer visible in our history. In the end, we must ask not only who the Sumerians were, but what they remembered, for buried beneath their cities are not just stones, but stories they believed were too important to forget and too dangerous to invent. Across the tablets and myths of Sumer, one group of beings stands out with such clarity and reverence that they seem to exist in a category all their own. The Sumerians called them Abgal or Abkalu. Later, Akkadian texts would preserve their names as well. These weren't gods to be worshipped from afar, nor spirits drifting unseen through temples. These were teachers, engineers, architects of knowledge. They walked alongside early humans, bore physical forms, and carried with them the very roots of civilization. Always they are seven. Always they emerge from water. Always they teach, and then they vanish. The most detailed accounts of these sages come from Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC, but drawing from temple archives already ancient in his time. He describes the first of the Abkalu as a creature named Oannes, who rose from the sea at sunrise and returned to it at dusk. Oannes had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head was a human head, and beneath the fish's tail were human feet. He wore the fish skin like a garment, yet the human form within it was active, intelligent, and articulate. He taught humans not in dreams or riddles, but plainly how to read and write, how to measure land, how to build cities, how to live by laws. He took no food, needed no sleep. His purpose was singular, to instruct. Following him came 6 more sages, each associated with a particular domain and a particular pre-flood city. Their names and contributions are recorded in clay as clearly as any human king's deeds. One taught agriculture, another taught metallurgy, one was said to have drawn the plans of heaven and earth, a phrase echoed in temple inscriptions, foundation texts, and star catalogues. These weren't vague attributions. These were professional specializations, almost like academic departments in a forgotten university. These beings did not hover above the people, they stood among them. Cylinder seals from the Uruk and Akkadian periods show fish-skinned humanoids standing beside kneeling human scribes. Their proportions are consistent broad shoulders, muscular torsos, scaled lower bodies, expressive human faces. They hold implements, rods, tablets, buckets, symbols of their domains. These are not wild, fantastical creatures. They are portrayed with anatomical logic, balance, and intent. Artists rendered them with the care of someone depicting something real. Their legacy extended beyond text and image. In the construction of temples, rulers often claim to be restoring what the Abgal first built. Foundation cylinders buried beneath sacred sites declare things like, according to the design laid down by the sages before the flood, or by the measurements given by the seven. These are not mythological flourishes. They are bureaucratic records of engineering work. They list dimensions, materials, quantities. The sages weren't symbolic, they were the source. Even the tools of these sages carry deep meaning. The buckets and pine cones seen in their hands across Mesopotamian art were not ornamental. The bucket is thought to have contained sacred water, perhaps for purification, perhaps for transferring knowledge. The pine cone may have been symbolic of fertility or consciousness, but the consistency with which they appear, across centuries and regions, suggests a codified function. These tools were associated with teaching, transformation, and continuity, the very things the Abgal embodied. In the palaces of the Neo-Assyrian kings, particularly at Nimrud, massive stone reliefs show the sages flanking doorways, performing rituals of protection and blessing. The inscriptions identify them not as imagined guardians, but as those who preserve the divine knowledge from before the flood. These were places of government, not just worship, and yet the ancient builders saw fit to include beings who had not been seen in living memory, but whose legacy still shaped the world around them. Temple hymns to Enki, god of wisdom and master of the Abzu, refer to the Abgal as his pure ones, the emissaries he sent to teach mankind. One hymn calls them the fish of the deep who come ashore to bear the word of order. Another describes them walking up from the sea, scales shining, voices clear, their feet wet with the knowledge of the deep. These aren't vague metaphors, they're poetic. Yes, but specific. The sages arrive by sea. They walk, they speak, they instruct, then, as suddenly as they appeared, they are gone. Their disappearance is always tied to the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of how, after the waters came, the sages no longer walked among men. In some versions, one or two survived, transformed, hidden, fading into legend, but their knowledge endured. The divine decrees that governed civilization were said to have been first carried by the Abgal. These included everything from legal systems to music, from mathematics to metallurgy. They were not just cultural ideas. They were functional instructions, blueprints for civilization, and the sages were the couriers. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian kings invoked the Abgal by name when constructing temples or claiming legitimacy. Esarhaddon, in the 7th century BC, buried a cylinder under the temple of Marduk, stating, "I restored it in accordance with the design of the sages of old, who first built when the world was young." This was not piety. It was continuity. It was the acknowledgement that kings rule only by borrowing from those who taught before. Even more remarkable are the technical manuals that survive. Some attributed directly to the Abgal. One text lists 7 tablets of instruction, each named for a specific sage. The subjects are not abstract. They include astronomy, architecture, medicine, agriculture, law, and metallurgy. These are the operational systems of an entire civilization. The knowledge is framed as received, not invented. And perhaps that's what makes the Abgal so uniquely unsettling. They are not presented as gods to be feared or appeased, but as teachers. They are not timeless forces, but temporal beings They came. They taught. They left. The Sumerians didn't pray to them. They learned from them. And in their absence, they preserved their image with obsessive fidelity. No new myths added wings. No later scribes added horns. Their forms remained constant. Their legacy remained fixed. It is difficult to find any other mythological beings in world history described with such anatomical precision and technical legacy. Egyptian gods shift over time. Greek titans evolve into more human forms. But the Abgal remains stable. This suggests not a myth in evolution, but a memory held in reverence. The Sumerians believed these beings had once been real, not just in spirit, but in form, not just in art, but in life. In the end, their legacy was not divinity, but instruction. They did not create humans, but they shaped what humans became. Civilization was not their gift, it was their curriculum. They passed on the knowledge. Then the flood came, then silence. What remains is stone and clay, filled with names, images, and dimensions. They left behind not legends but instructions. They were not meant to be worshipped. They were meant to be remembered. In the myths of most ancient civilizations, humans are shaped from clay, dust, or divine breath. The process is often poetic, metaphorical, a dance of gods bringing life to inert matter. But the Sumerians told a different story, a darker, more clinical, more deliberate origin. To them, humanity was not the crowning glory of creation. We were the solution to a problem, a replacement species designed for labor, shaped not from love or inspiration, but from necessity. The gods, if they can still be called that, needed workers. And they made us. The clearest account of this appears in the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian creation myth dated to around 1700 BC, though scholars believe it draws from older Sumerian sources. The story begins not with chaos or void, but with order already in place. The world exists. The canals are dug. The temples stand. The fields are sown. But the labor is not done by humans. It is done by the Igigi, younger gods or divine workers who toil endlessly under the command of higher deities like Enlil. They dig the trenches, carry the bricks, move the earth, and then they rebel. The Igigi gather at Enlil's temple, burn their tools, and declare their work unbearable. They are divine, they say, but treated like slaves. Enlil is enraged, but the problem is real. The gods convene a council, and Enki, lord of wisdom, master of the watery abyss, proposes a solution: create a new being, one designed specifically for labor, not divine, but durable, not eternal, but sufficient, a hybrid creature, part god, part earth, something that will never rebel, because it will not remember a time before work. The method of creation is not vague, it is procedural. Enki instructs that a god be sacrificed wailer, in some versions, and that his blood be mixed with clay. The mixture is to be shaped into bodies. The texts do not speak of breath or animation by magic. They speak of biological fusion, clay as a medium, blood as a catalyst. The product, a new species, humanity. Nintu, the mother goddess, is tasked with forming the beings. She creates 14-7 male, 7 female. The process is described in almost medical language. The texts mention birth pains, the opening of wombs, the cutting of cords. There are even references to prototypes, versions that failed. Some were mute, some blind, others unable to reproduce. Only after refinement does the viable model emerge, a being capable of speech, of movement, of understanding orders, a being made to serve. In one passage, Nintu holds up a newly created human and says, "I have created, my hands have made," but the celebration is brief. The humans are immediately put to work. They take over the tasks of the Igigi, digging canals, harvesting crops, maintaining temples. The gods withdraw, watching from afar. Humanity's role is clear and unchanging, to perform the labor the divine refused. This story is echoed in multiple texts. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, tells of the god Kingu, who leads a rebellion and is killed. His blood is used to form humans. Again, the emphasis is on mixture, divine essence fused with matter. Again, the purpose is service. Humans are made not as companions to the gods, but as a workforce. Our intelligence is sufficient, but bounded. Our bodies are mortal. Our memories are short. What makes these accounts so disturbing is their specificity. Myth usually speaks in metaphor. These texts describe ratios, methods, even biological constraints. They explain that the divine component gives humans consciousness, while the clay binds us to earth. We are not divine enough to transcend, nor base enough to forget. We are engineered to function, not to question. And yet, questions linger. Who was Wyler, the god whose blood became ours? What kind of being was he? If the Igigi were real, were they biological entities? Were they another species, one that preceded us and perished? The texts refer to them not as spirits, but as physical beings who lived, worked, and died. Some scholars have suggested they represent an earlier hominid species, Neanderthals, perhaps, or even something unknown. Others argue they were symbols of social hierarchy, but the language resists metaphor. The Igigi dig, they rebel, they gather in protest. These are actions, not archetypes. After the humans are created, the Igigi vanish from the narrative. Some traditions say they were allowed to rest, others suggest they were destroyed. But their place in the order of the world is erased. Humanity now fills the role. The world becomes ours, but not because we earned it, because we were made for it. One hymn compares the process of making humans to tempering copper. It speaks of controlling temperature, shaping the mixture, ensuring durability. This is not divine inspiration. It is metallurgical engineering. The metaphor implies a process of refinement, of experimentation, of deliberate creation under constraints. In other words, it suggests technology. Even more revealing are the texts that describe failed creations. In one version, early humans cannot speak. In another, they are malformed, unable to stand. One version describes beings too bright, whose presence disturbed the gods. They were removed, erased. These accounts hint at trial and error at a learning curve in creating a stable hybrid. If these are metaphors, they are strangely technical ones. If they are memories, they are chilling. There is also the matter of the me, the divine decrees or programs that govern civilization. The Sumerians believed these were given to humans after their creation, not as gifts, but as operational software. The me covered everything: justice, agriculture, priesthood, music, war. They were not laws in the legal sense. They were functions, modes of being, instructions for a species newly created and needing direction. In one version of the myth, Enki hides the me from humans, fearing they might use them incorrectly. In another, he distributes them carefully, assigning roles and responsibilities. The me are not taught, they are downloaded, transmitted, received. The implication is profound. Humanity was not just created physically, but also programmed behaviorally. And yet, the Sumerians never describe their creation as glorious. There is no pride in being made. In one lamentation, a priest sings, "We are born of blood not our own, shaped by hands we did not see, called to serve without knowing why." The emotion is not awe, it is resignation. The creators have left. The instructions remain. The purpose is clear, but the origin is not. What if the Sumerians were not speculating, but remembering? What if their stories are not metaphors, but testimonies? Accounts passed down from a time when knowledge was still fresh, when the distinction between human and non-human was recent, when the memory of those who made us was not yet buried beneath the sands. If so, then the story of human origin is not about enlightenment, it is about design, not divine destiny, but biological utility. We were made because another species no longer wished to dig ditches, and everything we became from farmers to kings was built on that beginning. We were not created to rule, we were created to obey. Long before the ink of kings and dynasties dried into tablets, before temples crowned ziggurats and scribes recorded trade or treaty, the Sumerians told stories about others, not just the Apkallu sages, not only the gods who issued decrees from on high, but whole beings' populations, intelligences that shared the earth with early humanity. These were not spirits or dreams. The texts described them with physicality, with origin, with behavior, and most important of all, with endings, because they did not last. When the flood came, they vanished. Their names remain, their shapes are carved in seal and stone, but their presence, their breath, their voices is gone. The most mysterious among them are the Igigi, the same beings who, according to the Atrahasis epic, labored under the high gods before humans were created. Their task was endless toil, dredging rivers, raising walls, feeding fires. They are described not as divine in the transcendent sense, but as biological laborers, made for physical endurance. For 40 years, they worked without relief. Then, they rebelled. They burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's temple, and demanded an end to their servitude. Their rebellion was not metaphorical, it was political, material. They were tired, angry, exhausted, and they were replaced. If the Igigi were real, what were they? Some interpret them as angels or stars, their rebellion an allegory for divine disorder. But the texts do not present them as concepts. They dig, they sweat, they protest, they have names, roles, and needs. They seem to occupy a space between mortal and divine, a species capable of suffering, but distinct from the humans that would follow. They are, in many ways, a failed experiment, or perhaps a first iteration. In one reading, the Igigi may have been early prototypes, strong, obedient, but too sentient. They rebelled, and for that, they were erased from history. Yet, not entirely. In some later texts, they linger, watching, dwelling in the sky, observing humanity from above. Their presence is rarely described again in the physical world after the flood, but their memory survives. In prayers and omens, in celestial metaphors, they become the watchers, not gods, not men, not quite gone. Another category of beings described by the Sumerians are those who came from the sky, the Anunnaki. Unlike the Igigi, the Anunnaki were not laborers. They were rulers, judges, beings of immense presence and ambiguous morality. They are described as descending from the heavens and walking among humans. Some texts place them in mountain sanctuaries, others in the deep underworld, but many describe them as giant figures with radiant skin, elongated heads, and voices that commanded obedience. In several flood myths, it is the Anunnaki who weep after the waters rise, not out of pity, but loss. They had ruled a world that no longer existed. Their reign, their age, had ended. Stranger still are the implications of interbreeding. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian myths speak of beings part human, part something else. Gilgamesh himself is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother is a goddess, his father a king, yet his strength, his size, his dreams all suggest something more than lineage. In his encounter with Enkidu, another being created by the gods. The line between human and animal, divine and mortal, blurs even further. Enkidu is born from clay, roams with beasts, and only becomes civilized through 7 days with the priestess Shamhat. Afterward, he speaks, understands, and weeps, but his strength is unmatched, his vision prophetic, his soul tormented. He is not human, but he is not human either. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often read as a moral tale about mortality, but under its poetry lies a biological puzzle. Enkidu and Gilgamesh both seem to be hybrids, engineered beings caught between species. They are stronger, wiser, more durable, but they are also unstable. Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu is not just for a friend. It is for a kind, perhaps the last of his kind, whose death marks the end of something ancient. Later, Akkadian and Assyrian writings expand the story. The sons of gods are said to mate with human women, producing offspring of immense stature and knowledge. These offspring giants, sages, monsters, are later cursed, hunted, or destroyed. The stories resonate with tales from other regions, the Nephilim of Hebrew tradition, the Titans of Greece, the Asuras of Vedic India. In each case, there is an ancient generation, powerful, sometimes benevolent, often terrible, that must be overthrown or eliminated before humanity can inherit the earth. Archaeologically, we find strange clues. In the deepest levels of Mesopotamian sites beneath flood layers and beneath recognizable Sumerian structures, tools appear that do not match known technologies. Obsidian blades with perfect edges, copper alloys requiring precise temperatures, carvings of figures with elongated skulls, scaled skin, bird-like faces. These are not always displayed in museums. Some are boxed, stored, labeled as anomalies, but they exist, and they match what the texts describe. Temple reliefs show non-human beings teaching humans. They are always larger, always in positions of authority, always surrounded by symbols of measurement, ropes, rods, tablets. These aren't worship scenes. They are classrooms, workshops, initiations. The humans kneel not in prayer, but in learning. The beings point, instruct, direct. What if these beings were real, not gods? Not spirits, but another intelligent species, extinct now, but once dominant? The Sumerians claimed to inherit civilization from them. The structures of the oldest cities, Eridu, Uruk, Kish, are built atop even older foundations. The measurements, proportions, alignments all suggest repetition, not invention. Who were the first builders? The first astronomers? The first lawmakers? The Sumerians name them, but do not claim to be them. This legacy of the others becomes clearer in how the Sumerians saw themselves. They did not boast of creating cities from nothing. They wrote of restoring them. They did not claim to invent writing. They described receiving it. The priests, kings, and scribes of Sumer lived with the knowledge that they were inheritors, not originators. That civilization did not begin with them. It resumed with them. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling idea. That human history is not a story of steady progress, but of succession. That before us came another species powerful, brilliant, flawed, and that we are simply the next iteration. The survivors, the hybrids, the workers who stayed behind when the teachers left. In Sumerian texts, the phrase "before the flood" does not mean myth. It means before us, before memory, before the silence that followed, and scattered across that silence are remnants, names, tools, images, rituals, traces of a world not lost, but buried, not forgotten, but deliberately sealed. We were not the first. The Sumerians tried to tell us, in clay and stone. They left a record of those who came before. And what they left behind, across the temples, palaces, and administrative archives of ancient Mesopotamia, a gallery of figures repeats with uncanny consistency. These are not human beings. Their heads are avian, their bodies scaled, their proportions elongated. They carry tools, measuring rods, pine cones, buckets, never weapons. They stand beside kings, instructing. They bless crops, survey land, mark foundations. Their wings spread wide behind them, carved with individual feathers and anatomical accuracy, from Eridu to Nineveh, from the earliest Sumerian cylinder seals to the colossal Assyrian stone reliefs. These figures appear in the same postures, performing the same acts. They are not decorative, they are deliberate, and they have been remembered. Walk through the Mesopotamian galleries of the British Museum, the Louvre, the Pergamon Museum. You will see them on clay tablets, cylinder seals, bronze plaques, beings with eagle heads and human torsos, beings with fishtails and muscular arms, beings with reptilian features, standing upright. These forms do not drift over time. In over 2,000 years of artistic tradition, the anatomy remains fixed: bird-beaked faces, powerful limbs, feathered wings, scaled skin. Their actions are consistent too: teaching, building, guarding. This is not myth in flux. This is memory held tight. In the palace of Ashurnasirpal II in Nimrud, built in the 9th century BC, enormous reliefs show four-winged bird-headed beings flanking the entrance halls. Their size is not an exaggeration of divine presence. It is proportionally consistent across dozens of panels. When shown beside human attendants, they are 1.5 times taller, always the same ratio. This scale is not artistic liberty, it is reference. The artists of Assyria, like their Sumerian ancestors, were not inventing, they were copying a known model. Some scholars have attempted to explain these figures as priests in ritual costumes, shamans visualized in transformed states, or purely symbolic personifications. But these interpretations fall short when the evidence is examined closely. When humans are depicted wearing animal masks, the masks are clearly shown as objects. You can see the straps, the folds, the partial human faces beneath, but the bird-headed beings do not wear anything. Their beaks extend naturally from their faces. Their eyes are avian. Their necks align with the spine as a real bird's would. These are not costumes. They are biological forms. Equally striking are the depictions of wings, in relief after relief. The feathers are not stylized. They are anatomical, complete with primaries, secondaries, and coverts. They attach at the shoulder blades as they would in a bird's skeleton. Their curvature follows natural flight structure. This level of detail would be unnecessary for symbolism, but it is consistent for accurate depiction. Why would artists preserve such anatomical fidelity unless they were trying to record a species that once existed? Then there are the scaled beings, often shown with human arms and torsos. But their skin, especially from the waist down, is covered in overlapping fish or reptile-like scales. The detail is astonishing. Smaller scales at the joints, larger ones along the thighs and torso. Sometimes they carry objects. Sometimes they raise a hand in a gesture of blessing. On one Kassite boundary stone, a scaled figure stands holding a staff, topped with a symbol that resembles the omega, the sign of completion or eternity. The inscription refers to the one who measures, guardian of the first boundaries. Not a god, not a metaphor, a measurer. The famous Walk of Vase, dated to around 3200 BC, presents another layered scene. At the bottom, grains and water. In the middle, animals and humans. At the top, a goddess, receiving offerings. But she is not alone. Flanking her are two tall figures. Their torsos are too long, their arms too thin, their heads vaguely inhuman. They are not labelled, Museum placards call them attendants, but their placement and presence suggest otherwise. They are not secondary. They are central. They are, perhaps, what memory could not fully explain, but could not forget either. In Sumerian terminology, these beings are often marked with the determinative dingir, translated as God, but more accurately rendered, those from the shining. The word implies origin, not holiness. It implies arrival from the sky, from the sea, from the unknown. And while some of these beings are placed in celestial contexts, many are shown doing very grounded tasks, holding surveying cords, pouring sacred water, arranging tools for construction. Their realm is not distant. It is here. Foundation plaques from early temples often include miniature clay models of these beings, buried beneath the floor during construction. They are rough, unsophisticated compared to public art, yet unmistakable in form, fish-tailed, winged, bird-headed. They were not meant for display. They were meant for ritual remembrance, buried where no one would see them again, placed as protectors, or perhaps acknowledgements of the original builders, those who measured the land long before the current kings. Even the most sacred symbols of Mesopotamian religion reinforce this separation between humans and the others. The eight-pointed star, symbolizing divine or skyborn origin, is never shown above human figures. It appears only above non-human forms, beings with wings, scales, or avian heads. The iconography is systematic. The taxonomy is deliberate. There are categories of beings, and humans were not alone. This artistic grammar, this visual language, remained intact across empires. From the early Sumerians to the Akkadians, from the Babylonians to the Assyrians, the same beings appear in the same roles, with the same forms. The continuity is unprecedented. Artistic traditions normally evolve. Egyptian gods acquire new traits. Greek myths blur. But in Mesopotamia, these beings do not change. That level of consistency implies more than tradition. It implies memory. In 1936, during excavations at Nimrud, archaeologist Max Mallowan discovered a set of bronze figurines buried beneath a temple floor. They depicted bird-headed, winged beings with extraordinary detail. But metallurgical analysis revealed something astonishing. The figurines were crafted using techniques known from the Akkadian period over 500 years earlier than the Neo-Assyrian temple in which they were found. They were already ancient when buried, yet their forms were still understood, still recognized. The ancient Mesopotamians did not invent these beings, they inherited them. And their artists, architects, priests, and kings made every effort to preserve their image exactly, not because they believed they were divine metaphors, but because they believed they were real. Real beings who once walked beside humans, real teachers who measured the world, real presences whose absence was felt deeply after the flood. And perhaps most haunting is this: these beings are never shown dying, never shown decaying, never shown aging. They appear fully formed, fully capable, and then they are gone. The flood marks their end, not by depiction, but by silence. After the deluge, they are remembered only in stone, only in seals, only in art that no longer matches the beings seen with human eyes. But the Sumerians remembered. They pressed these forms into clay. They carved them into doorways. They buried them beneath temples. And they recorded their names, their roles, their actions, so that someone, someday, might ask, who were they? Why did they leave? And what remains of them beneath our feet? Beneath the cracked soil of ancient Mesopotamia, where empires once rose and fell like tides of stone and blood, lie the foundations of something older, something the Sumerians never claimed as their own. They built upon it. Yes, they honored it, but they did not pretend to create it. In text after text, they refer to structures as being restored, not founded. They rebuilt according to the plans from before the flood, They followed measurements left by the ones who measured before, and the deeper archaeologists dig into the ruins of cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, the more those claims seem to hold weight. The earliest layers of these cities are not crude beginnings. They are precise, geometric, engineered. They do not suggest a society learning how to build. They suggest a society trying to remember how to rebuild. At Eridu, the first city in Sumerian memory, excavations revealed a temple mound built layer upon layer, 17 temples, each constructed directly atop the last. The oldest, Temple I, dates to approximately 5,400 BC, long before the rise of Sumerian kingship. It rests on virgin soil, no previous human activity beneath it. Yet, even this earliest temple is aligned to the cardinal points. Its layout is proportional, its brick sizes standardized. There is no trial phase, no primitive version. The first known temple is already optimized. The builders knew exactly what they were doing. At Uruk, a similar mystery unfolded beneath the White Temple, a gleaming ziggurat visible from miles across the desert when it stood in its prime. Beneath its platform, archaeologists uncovered foundation stones transported from quarries over 60 miles away. These stones weighed several tons each and were dressed with such precision that they locked together without mortar. The quarry itself left no evidence of how the blocks were moved. There were no sleds, no ramps, no drag marks, yet here they were cut, moved, and set in place. Before the invention of the wheel, before the widespread use of metal tools, the labor required would have demanded not just manpower, but logistics planning, coordination, leadership. But from whom? Kish tells a stranger story. In strata dated to around 7000 BC, well before the Sumerian period, archaeologists discovered flint tools, obsidian blades, and a single limestone block carved with symbols that do not match any known script. Some suggest the markings may represent a pre-cuneiform proto-language. Others argue they are decorative, but none can explain how they came to be in a context that should have been prehistoric. There were no known cities in southern Mesopotamia at that time, and yet the stone lay embedded in what was clearly the foundation of a structure. These are not isolated incidents across Mesopotamia. Foundation deposits, inscribed cylinders and plaques buried at the corners of temples reveal a recurring formula, rebuilt according to the plan from ancient times. Kings from multiple periods invoke the same language. Namu, Gudea, Esarhaddon all claim to have restored temples to their original dimensions, guided not by vision, but by instruction. Some even describe dreams in which the gods, or sages from before the flood, show them the correct measurements. These are not metaphors for divine inspiration. These are technical mandates, architectural directives passed across generations. A Babylonian tablet from the 6th century BC tells how the Temple of Marduk was reconstructed using the design drawn on the clay of the Abzu, attributed to the god Ea before the deluge. The Abzu, the watery deep beneath the earth, was said to be the domain of ancient knowledge, and the idea that plans were inscribed there, saved, stored, and retrieved after catastrophe suggests a kind of preservation system, not oral tradition. Documentation. The question becomes, who made the original plans? In Sumerian art and myth, the answer is clear. The Abkalu, the 7 sages, are repeatedly described as the first architects. They emerge from the sea, bearing measuring rods, surveying ropes, and tablets. They teach the first kings how to build. Cylinder seals show them in the act laying bricks, blessing foundations, advising rulers. They are not worshipped. They are consulted. They do not demand offerings. They deliver knowledge. Some of the earliest temples even include stylized blueprints, floor plans carved into tablets, scale models buried beneath altars, and dimensional inscriptions that match the building itself. These are not symbolic, they are functional, and in some cases, they do not match the time period in which they were buried. Several temples contain measurements that align with astronomical orientations, the solstices, the equinoxes, the rising and setting of Venus. To align a structure in this way requires not only tools, but long-term observation of the sky. Yet these alignments appear in the oldest temples, not the latest. Were these capabilities developed over centuries of trial and error? The archaeological record does not support that. There is no evolutionary chain of construction techniques in early Mesopotamia. No crude mud huts giving way to complex temples. The complexity appears immediately, as if inherited, not discovered. This theme is reinforced in Sumerian creation myths. The Me, the divine decrees or blueprints for civilization, are said to include the principles of architecture. One Me governs the building of temples. Another, the measuring of lands. These are not abstract concepts. They are skills, and they are described as given, not developed. Even the tools depicted in ancient art support this claim. Measuring rods appear again and again, always in the hands of non-human figures. These rods are marked with divisions, much like a modern ruler. The coils they carry, like surveying ropes, suggest knowledge of geometry. Some seals even show the beings stretching the rope between stakes. Aligning construction, humans kneel beside them. Watching, not participating. The message is unmistakable. They taught, we learned. At sites like Nippur and Lagash, foundations contain inscriptions invoking the ancient ones who set the first bricks. These beings are never named. They are not gods in the traditional sense. They are predecessors. Their measurements are precise. Their memory is honored. Their identities remain unknown. Modern engineering analysis of some ancient structures reveals mathematical constants embedded in the design ratios that suggest understanding of pi, the golden ratio, or harmonic proportions. These constants reappear in multiple cities across centuries. They are not flukes. They are intentional standards. Yet they predate known mathematical texts. Again, we return to the same possibility. Someone knew these things before the rise of Sumer. Perhaps most eerie are the references to rebuilding after destruction. Multiple tablets describe how, following the flood, temples were not created from imagination, but from memory or even from physical copies. One fragment from Eridu reads, "The bricks I set were of the same count, the walls of the same height, as it was before the waters came, the level of detail number of bricks. Height of walls suggests access to actual records. These were not myths of rebirth, they were acts of restoration. What kind of civilization leaves behind no language, no name, but perfect geometry? Who constructs in silence, then vanishes beneath clay? The Sumerians never claimed to know. They only claimed to follow. They measured their cities by ancient standards. They placed their temples atop older ruins. They buried figurines beneath their floors, shaped like fishmen and bird-headed beings. Not to honor fantasy. To remember teachers, we do not know the names of the first architects of Sumer, but the Sumerians believed they did. They called them the ones who came before, and they built their cities in the shadows of that memory. Among the many marvels of the Sumerians' writing, cities, law codes, and mathematics, their astronomy stands as one of the most staggering, not because they gazed at the stars, as many ancient cultures did, but because of how much they knew and how early they knew it. Their records show them tracking planetary motions, lunar cycles, eclipses, solstices, and equinoxes. They mapped the paths of Venus with a precision that would not be equaled until telescopes were invented. And perhaps most haunting of all, they seem to have had knowledge of celestial cycles that require thousands of years of continuous observation, far more than the length of their own documented civilization. Which begs a single, disturbing question. Who gave them this knowledge? The key astronomical text from Mesopotamia is known as Mul, Apin, a star catalogue compiled around 1000 BC, but acknowledged by its own scribes as a copy from far older sources. The tablets contain exhaustive lists of constellations, rising and setting times, and mathematical methods for predicting lunar eclipses and planetary conjunctions. Their data on the Venus cycle is so accurate that modern astronomers have verified its alignment with actual orbital behavior, matching with a margin of error of only a few days across an 8-year cycle. Yet this requires more than casual stargazing. It demands systematic tracking, recording, and modeling over generations. In several texts, Sumerian scribes explicitly state that the star measurements they were copying were not their own observations, but the records of those who came before the flood. One tablet describes how the stations of the stars were set by the measurers of old, while another claims that the knowledge was inscribed before the kingship was lowered from heaven. The verbs used, set, measured, established, are active, technical, and purposeful. They suggest agency and not human agency. Consider this. The Earth's axis wobbles slowly over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, a phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes. To notice this shift requires meticulous observation of the stars over millennia. As the position of sunrise on the equinox slowly changes against the background of constellations. Modern science only confirmed this cycle in the 2nd century BC through the work of Hipparchus. Yet some scholars argue that Sumerian texts, particularly mythological references to 12 shifting ages ruled by zodiacal constellations, encode this knowledge thousands of years earlier. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, each age is ruled by a different symbol of the sky, and the ages move backward through the zodiac, the very direction of precessional drift. This would mean that Sumerian astronomers were either extrapolating data across massive time spans, or that the data had been inherited from sources with access to much older records. The Sumerians themselves make it clear which they believed. They did not claim discovery. They claimed transmission. Their number system alone hints at this. The Sumerians used a base 60 sexagesimal system, which is mathematically ideal for astronomy. It allows division by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, far more versatile than our base 10 system. This is why we still divide circles into 360 degrees and time into units of 60. But no evolutionary path leads to this system from earlier forms. It appears fully formed, with no gradual development visible in the archaeological record. Why 60? Why not 10? Based on fingers, like nearly every other culture? The Sumerians do not explain. They simply use it flawlessly. As if it was taught, cuneiform tablets describe the me, the divine decrees, or blueprints of reality, as including the measurement of the heavens. One text lists the specific me given to humanity by the god Enki. Among them, the knowledge of the stars, the calculation of days, the understanding of signs in the sky. These were not poetic abilities. They were practical skills, framed as gifts or tools given by non-human teachers. On many cylinder seals, non-human beings are shown holding surveying instruments, rods marked with increments, ropes stretched between pegs, tools of geometry and astronomy. In one famous seal, a fishman figure points a rod at a star symbol while kneeling humans observe. These are not symbols of spiritual illumination. They are lessons in measurement. Some temples, especially at Uruk and Eridu, are oriented with uncanny precision to celestial events. The ziggurat at Ur, for instance, aligns to the summer solstice sunset, while other temples align with equinox sunrises or lunar standstills. The alignments are not approximate, they are within 1 degree of astronomical accuracy. To build structures aligned so precisely requires not only architectural skill, but detailed astronomical data collected over decades, if not centuries. Yet these alignments appear in the earliest layers of these cities. How did they know? Some suggest the Sumerians used gnomons, vertical sticks that cast shadows. Others suggest they used water clocks or early astrolabes. But all of these require a prior understanding of what to look for. You do not build a solstice-aligned temple without knowing what the solstice is and when it occurs. That requires long-term, multi-generational observation, or access to pre-existing data. In the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, clay tablets were found detailing methods for predicting eclipses, calculating planetary retrogrades, and interpreting the movement of Venus in the morning and evening skies. Some of these tablets include not just tables, but diagrams, sky charts, angular measurements, mathematical functions. They read less like mythology and more like astronomical manuals, and many are copies of earlier works. The scribes note this with humility. I have copied the knowledge of the ancient ones. Menda. In one text, the source is made explicit, the secret of the gods, which the sages brought from the Apsu before the flood destroyed their dwellings. The Apsu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, was the domain of Enki, the god associated with the Abkalu, and those sages, always seven, always from the deep, are credited with giving humanity astronomy. The Epic of Gilgamesh supports this. When Gilgamesh seeks the secret of immortality, he visits Utnapishtim, the flood survivor. Utnapishtim explains that the instructions for survival, how to build the boat, when to launch it, were given to him by Ea, the god of wisdom, through a dream. But Ea's words are based not on divine whim, but on knowledge recorded by the sages, who knew the movements of heaven. Again, the chain of knowledge is clear. The gods did not invent it. They preserved it. The sages transmitted it. Humans received it. Perhaps the most compelling evidence lies not in text, but in the sky. The Sumerians divided the year into 12 months, tracked the synodic cycles of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn, and created a lunisolar calendar that adjusted for the shifting relationship between the moon and the sun. They plotted the rising and setting points of major stars. They named constellations still in use today. And all of this appeared at the dawn of their civilization, not at the end. How does such knowledge emerge without development? Either the Sumerians were the most gifted observers in human history, or they were telling the truth, that someone else taught them. That the beings with fish tails and bird heads were not myths, but mentors. That the measurers of the sky had watched the heavens long before humans had names for stars. If that is true, then the legacy of those beings is not just in the myths, it's in our clocks, our calendars, our geometry, our architecture. We carry their legacy every time we count 60 seconds or divide a circle. The Sumerians wrote it down. We still live by it, but we no longer remember why. The tablets do not say how it happened. They do not describe a final battle, a great extinction, or a cosmic departure written in fire across the skies. They only record the silence. One moment, the world was shared by humans and others, by sages from the sea and radiant beings from the sky. Then, after the flood, the world was quieter. The beings the Sumerians had recorded with such anatomical precision, such awe, such reverence were no longer present. Their names remained, their images were carved in stone, but their presence faded into myth. What happened to them? 3 main possibilities emerge from the texts, each echoed in fragmentary inscriptions, temple hymns, foundation tablets, and the quiet absence that follows the flood. None of them are mutually exclusive. Together, they form a picture not of one vanishing, but of multiple endings: extinction, withdrawal, assimilation. The first, and perhaps most straightforward, is catastrophic extinction. In every Mesopotamian tradition, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood, is described not as a seasonal occurrence or a regional disaster, but as a civilizational reset. A moment when entire species, entire lineages, were wiped away. The gods decide to destroy the world. The flood comes suddenly, violently. Rain pours for days. Waves cover the cities. Wind and water become indistinguishable. And when it ends, the survivors emerge into a world stripped of its diversity, not just in flora and fauna, but in intelligence. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim describes releasing birds after the storm: a dove, a swallow, a raven. The raven, finding flesh, does not return. The implication is gruesome. The world is littered with corpses, not just of humans, but of others. Later texts speak of the flood as washing away the old forms, of silencing the voices that spoke before kings. If these other beings were already small in number, isolated in specific regions, coastal cities now lost beneath the Persian Gulf, mountain dwellings erased by landslides, then a massive flood could have easily reduced them below the threshold of survival. Not every extinction leaves bones. Geological evidence from southern Mesopotamia supports the idea of a sudden, widespread disaster around 2900 BC. Multiple cities show flood layers, 8 feet of water-laid clay at Ur, similar deposits at Kish and Shuruppak. These layers are not gradual. They represent abrupt termination of one cultural stratum and the emergence of another. Tools change. Building techniques shift. Iconography becomes more symbolic, less representational. If these layers mark the moment of disappearance, then something was lost that could never be rebuilt. But not all texts speak of death. Some describe withdrawal. In many accounts, the beings from before the flood do not die, they depart. The Apkallu, the 7 sages who taught humanity, are said to return to the Abzu after their work is done. The Anunnaki, the shining ones from the sky, ascend again, their cities abandoned. Temple inscriptions speak of gods who left the land and returned to their place in the heavens. In one hymn, a priest laments, "We searched the skies and the sea, but they answered not. They had gone where we cannot follow." This theme of retreat repeats in Assyrian and Babylonian traditions. The divine ones are no longer present in daily life. They are invoked, remembered, but not encountered. In Akkadian texts, it is said that they watched from afar, no longer walking among mortals. Perhaps they foresaw the coming flood and fled. Perhaps their time among humans was always meant to be temporary. Perhaps their mission was complete, but the effect was the same. A world once shared became ours alone. The third possibility is the most haunting: assimilation. If the beings who came before were not immortal gods, but biological entities advanced, yes, but flesh and blood, then they may not have vanished entirely. They may have interbred with humans. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of beings who are part divine, part mortal. Gilgamesh himself is 2/3 god, 1/3 man. Enkidu is shaped from clay by divine hands. Yet he is fully physical, capable of emotion, love, friendship, death. In other traditions, the sons of the gods take human wives, and their children are giants, heroes, kings. These hybrids live among humans, rule them, protect them. But over generations, their uniqueness fades. The genetic legacy of a non-human species, if real, would dilute quickly through intermarriage. Traits might remain: unusual height, intelligence, skull shape, but over time, they would disappear into the population. The beings who once stood apart would be absorbed. Their knowledge might survive in rituals, in architecture, in math, but their bodies would not. This might explain why later kings claimed divine ancestry, why certain bloodlines are deemed sacred, why the high priesthood guarded genealogies like secrets. It also might explain why temple rituals involve invocation of names no longer associated with visible beings. The beings were gone, but something of them remained, in memory, in flesh. Yet one more possibility exists: It is never stated openly, but it lingers beneath the surface of the texts, like sediment underwater. Deliberate erasure. The gods in the Atrahasis epic do not just send the flood, they choose to end what came before. They call a council. They agree. They flood the earth not out of rage, but out of purpose. When Enki disobeys and saves Utnapishtim, he is reprimanded, but the new world begins regardless. The implication is that the flood was not punishment, it was transition, from a world of multiple intelligent beings to a world of one. Us. Why? Perhaps the multiform world was unstable. Perhaps the coexistence of different species led to tension, resource conflict, war. The texts hint at such struggles, rebellions of the Agigi, rivalries among the Anunnaki, betrayals among the divine. Perhaps humanity was created not just to serve, but to replace. And once our role began, the others had to be removed, by nature or by force. The Eridu Genesis contains a chilling line. After the flood, kingship descended again from heaven, but only to men, not to sages, not to giants, not to radiant beings from the stars, just men. The succession was absolute and final. So the disappearance of the others may not have been passive. It may have been orchestrated, a transition from a world built by many intelligences to a world ruled by one. A consolidation, a culling. And yet, memory resists erasure. The images remain. The seals, the inscriptions, the recurring phrase, before the flood, before kingship came to man, before the temples were rebuilt, before we forgot. The Sumerians remembered not only what came after, but what came before. They carved the memories into stone. They whispered them in ritual. They buried them beneath temples, so that one day someone might ask not, what did the Sumerians believe, but who were they trying not to forget? There is a weight to what the Sumerians wrote, something that lingers not just in the content of their texts, but in the silence surrounding them. They were not shy about naming kings or cataloguing trade. Their cuneiform inscriptions record everything from tax receipts to temple rituals with obsessive precision. Yet when it comes to the beings who came before those who ruled before kingship was lowered, who measured the heavens, who walked among mortals, the tone changes. Their names are spoken with care. Their images are buried beneath foundations. And after the flood, their presence retreats into abstraction. They are no longer described in the present tense. They are remembered, but cautiously. It is as if the Sumerians understood they were preserving something not everyone was meant to know. This tension permeates the mythology. In one fragment, a priest writes, "We speak their names in darkness, for the light has forgotten them." In another, a king restoring a temple notes, "I built upon the stones set by the ancients, but I did not ask who placed them." These aren't poetic flourishes. They are records of discomfort, of knowledge kept in the corner of the mind, revered, but not fully spoken aloud. The memory of the others is preserved not in public celebration, but in ritual, in architecture, in whispered references to those who measured before. Is have to the prases. Why would a civilization that credited its very existence to these beings gradually stop speaking of them openly? The answer may lie not in reverence, but in danger. Remembering them fractures the story we tell ourselves that humans are the authors of civilization, that our progress was earned, that we are the original minds behind timekeeping, writing, agriculture, astronomy. But the Sumerians didn't tell that story. They said they were taught, that what they had was inherited. Their temples were built on ruins. Their measurements were handed down. Their myths do not exalt human brilliance, they reveal human succession. We came after. And perhaps that's what became intolerable. The moment humanity began to build its own cities, to erect its own statues, to write its own laws, perhaps it became necessary to bury the memory of those who had done it first. Not because it was untrue, but because it was uncomfortable. Because it meant we were not the first. Because it meant we had been helped. because it meant we were not alone in the beginning and perhaps not alone now. In later Mesopotamian texts, this discomfort becomes visible. The Apkallu, once revered as fish-skinned sages who built the world, are recast as ambiguous figures. In the Babylonian king list of the West, some are called demons, others are cast out. In the apocalyptic writings of later cultures, the sons of gods become monsters, the giants become abominations, the Nephilim must be drowned. What was once honor becomes heresy. The transformation is deliberate. It's not that the stories changed, it's that the stories were rebranded. Teachers became threats. Sages became sorcerers. The luminous ones who measured the stars were reclassified as dangerous, even evil. Why? Because they no longer fit the new worldview. A worldview where humans had to be central, had to be supreme. Anything else was inconvenient. This process is not unique to Mesopotamia. In Greece, the Titans, who ruled before the gods, are imprisoned in Tartarus. In India, the Asuras are cast as demons. In Judeo-Christian texts, the Watchers who once guided humanity fall from grace. Every tradition that speaks of a pre-human intelligence also eventually suppresses it. There is a pattern, a cultural editing that emerges wherever these stories survive. Even the archaeological record reflects this erasure. The oldest foundation layers, the ones with anomalous stones, advanced tool marks, and unexplained construction, are often not published widely. They are noted in field reports, logged in museum storage rooms, but rarely displayed. When unusual figurines appear, fishmen, bird-headed beings, they are labeled as mythological, not questioned. When inscriptions reference plans from before the flood or blueprints from ancient builders, they are seen as poetic metaphor, not data. But the Sumerians did not write like poets. They wrote like engineers, like administrators. Their texts are dense with numbers, specifications, lists. When they say a temple was rebuilt, according to the plan drawn before the waters, they don't mean it poetically. They mean they followed something real. And when they describe beings with wings, scales, radiant skin, and luminous eyes, they do not say as if. They say they came. They say they taught. They say they left. To accept their testimony is to undo much of what we believe about ourselves, about the uniqueness of our intelligence, about the progression of our technology, about the isolation of our species. That is why the memory had to be wrapped in myth so that it could be dismissed. That is why the fishmen became decorative motifs, why the bird-headed figures became deities, why the king lists were called symbolic. So, the danger could be contained, because the real fear is not that ancient beings walked among us. The real fear is that they measured us and found us unfinished. That's why these memories are buried beneath ziggurats, not celebrated atop them. That's why their names appear in temple inscriptions but not royal titles. That's why. In one of the last surviving fragments from a Babylonian temple, a priest prays, "Let the watchers rest, for we no longer seek their eyes." The Karsunas, the Sumerians, passed down their knowledge with care, but they also encoded their discomfort. They recorded what they had been taught, but never forgot who the teachers were. And somewhere along the way, they learned that some memories are dangerous not because they are false, but because they are too true. What if the Sumerians weren't writing mythology? What if they were documenting, with precision and restraint, a past that modern humanity cannot bear to claim, a past in which we are not the source but the outcome, not the creators but the created? What if their stories weren't imagination but inheritance? They carved their warnings into stone. They hid their memories in clay, and they left behind a final silence, not of ignorance, but of choice. Sometimes, the greatest act of reverence is forgetting. Beneath the scorching winds and shifting sands of southern Iraq, under the ruins of ziggurats and the fractured bones of vanished cities, lie foundations older than memory. They are not only older than writing, they are older than the civilization that invented writing. At sites like Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, archaeologists have dug through temple floors, past ash and sediment, through brick and bone, and arrived at the base. There, they found something strange, not the primitive beginnings of a culture, but the remnants of a structure already designed, already aligned to the stars, already built to last. The deeper they went, the more refined the architecture became. The contradiction was clear. Human civilization should have begun simple, but at its roots it was complex. In Eridu, once called the first city by the Sumerians themselves, excavators unearthed 17 temples stacked atop one another, each built directly on the ruins of the last. The oldest, Temple I, sat on untouched earth, no earlier village, no debris of earlier culture beneath it, and yet it was already aligned to the cardinal directions, built with consistent brick dimensions, and following geometric ratios that later Sumerian architects would continue to use for centuries. No signs of experimentation, no first attempts, just a plan, already known, already applied. At Uruk, the same pattern emerged. Beneath the grand white temple built around 3200 BC lay older foundations, using limestone blocks weighing multiple tons, brought from quarries more than 60 miles away. These blocks were shaped with unknown techniques, fitted with incredible precision. No drag marks, no signs of sleds, no indications of how such massive stones were transported or placed. The architectural knowledge required to accomplish this is simply not accounted for by any known technology of that period. And still, there it was buried, ignored, misattributed, a construction with no known builder. Then came the discovery at Kish, a limestone foundation block inscribed with unknown symbols, pulled from a layer dated to 7000 BC, over 1,000 years before the Sumerians began writing. No one can read the symbols. They resemble no known script, but someone carved them. Someone placed that block with care, and someone buried it as a cornerstone. The language may be lost, but the intention is unmistakable. It is the language of builders, of memory, of design. In Sumerian texts, time is divided in two. Before the flood, after the flood, the deluge is not a metaphor. It is a wall, one that separates a world shared with others from the world we inherited. After the flood, kingship returns. Temples are rebuilt. Cities rise again. But the Sumerians never claim they were the first to build. They say again and again, "We restored the measurements of the ancients. We rebuilt on the foundations laid before the waters. We remembered the plans given by those who came before." These are not metaphors. They are records, not myths, but instructions. Temple inscriptions invoke not gods, but sages, engineers, those who came from the sea and the sky to teach, to build, to measure. They are never shown dying. They are never depicted being born. They simply appear, perform their role, then leave. Their forms are burned into thousands of years of art, bird-headed, fish-skinned, winged, scaled, robed in ritual. They carry tools, not weapons. Their posture is always the same: teaching, instructing, blessing, and then, after the flood, they vanish. They do not age. They do not decay. They are remembered but only in stone. And what of the flood itself? In Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak, archaeologists found water-laid clay between cultural layers, separating older construction from newer. The flood was real, though not global. A massive event that wiped out lowland cities, destroyed knowledge, and buried the past beneath silt. Afterward, a new society rose: Sumerian. Yes, but different, less detailed in its art, less daring in its scale. It built in the shadow of what it had lost. It recorded memories in stylized forms, invented gods to explain what it no longer understood, and carved the images of its forgotten teachers into the walls of temples so they would not be erased. Yet for all their precision, the Sumerians never finished the story. They did not tell us who these beings were, only what they did. They left no instructions for how to find them, only the evidence of what they left behind. They did not say why the flood came, only that after it, the world was different. And most of all, they did not ask us to believe. They asked us to remember. In the final fragments of their writing, the tone shifts. They speak less of rulers and more of loss. The ones who built with us are gone, says one hymn. Their measures remain, but their hands are dust. Another text laments. We tried to recall the shapes they used, the stars they followed, the sounds they spoke, but we are children, imitating giants. The authors knew the knowledge they preserved was incomplete, that they had inherited without full understanding, and that one day someone might come to the same stones, the same symbols, and ask the same questions. We now live in that day. Modern archaeology has unearthed the layers, the anomalous tools, the impossible alignments, the repeated proportions, the recurring beings, the builders no one can name, the seals that show non-human forms holding measuring cords beside kneeling kings. We have the data, but not the framework, because the only framework that fits is one we are not ready to accept, that the first cities were not built by us, that the first measurements were not invented by humans, that before we rose, others ruled, and when they left or were lost, we inherited the ruins, the stories, the echoes, and the instinct to build again, even without knowing why. This is why the Sumerians matter, not because they were the beginning, but because they were the first to admit they were not. They recorded their inheritance without altering it. They described what they saw. They noted what they rebuilt. And in doing so, they left behind the greatest question of all. If humans were not the first, then what came before us? We may never find their bones. The flood buried them too deep. We may never recover their names. Time has scraped them from the clay, but their fingerprints remain in the brick patterns, in the temple blueprints, in the star charts that match no human observation. And maybe that's enough, because memory does not always need flesh. Sometimes it only needs stone.